Hello everyone, I'm Aileen Carroll, sommelier with Lynfred Winery. Thank you all so much for joining me today for another of our virtual guided tasting packages. I'm especially honored to be a part of this one because not only do we get to enjoy some delicious wines and learn a bit, we're drinking for a cause today. Yes, a large portion of the proceeds from the sales of this particular tasting package are going to go to benefit charity, specifically a charity that helps relieve hunger in our local community of Roselle. The wines that we'll be featuring today include our 2019 Sauvignon Blanc, our 2019 Sparkling Rosé, and our 2016 Teroldego-Petite Sirah blend. So since we have so many different styles of wine represented today, that'll give us a really great chance to discover all the slightly different methods that go into making these different styles of wine, because as you may or may not know, the way that white wine is made is different from how red wine is made, is different how rosé is made, and sparkling wine is different than how still wine is made. So lots of fun stuff to learn about there. I'll also be offering some tips and tricks for how you can improve your tasting skills. And I will, of course, be including excellent food and wine pairing recommendations for you, as well as demonstrating the proper way to open a bottle of sparkling. Sound good? Let's get started. So we are beginning with our 2019 Sauvignon Blanc, because when you're doing a wine flight, you do want to start with the lightest style of wine and work your way up to the big bold reds, because if you were to start with red, your palate would be kind of overwhelmed and you wouldn't be able to appreciate the nuances of the lighter white wines. Speaking of appreciating nuances, I also am going to be talking throughout this video about the proper serving temperatures for each of these different styles of wine. White wine, surprise, you're actually not supposed to serve quite as cold as the average fridge temperature. I know. So the average fridge is about 40 degrees, but you want to serve light body white wines like Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio, for example, actually at about 45, maybe even up to 50 degrees. And the reason for this is because if you serve a white wine right out of the fridge, it's going to be so cold and like condensed that you won't be able to pick out as much of the aroma as if you let it warm up just a little bit. So I let this bottle of Sauvignon Blanc sit out of the fridge for about 15 minutes before I started this video, so that would be at exactly the right temperature. And speaking of, that's also the reason why we hold any wine by the stem, so as to not let the warmth of our body interfere with that perfect serving temperature. So let's move on to appreciating those aromas in our Sauvignon Blanc so that we can move on to drinking it. In addition to holding it by the stem, which seems very fancy, you'll see that I'm swirling the wine, which also seems very fancy, but there is a good reason for that as well, just like there was a good reason for holding it by the stem. So the reason we swirl the wine before we smell it is that allows the wine to essentially evaporate just a little tiny bit into the glass so that the aromas collect and we're able to pick them out. Now, in order to improve your nose and palate in picking out the aromas and flavors of white wine, we want to think of three broad categories and kind of jog our imagination within those to pick out more specific things. So with white wine, I want you to think of three categories: citrus, orchard fruit, which includes apples, pears, apricots, things that grow in orchards, and then tropical fruit. So when you're investigating the aromas of a white wine, see if any of those three categories sparks your imagination at all. I definitely would say citrus here to start. So then you can ask your imagination, well, what are all of the citrus fruits that I can think of? Lemon, lime, orange, grapefruit. So of those, what are we smelling? I want to say lemon and also lime. And then for extra points, you can ask your imagination about the color or character of that fruit, meaning is it a super tart lemon, or is it like lemon curd? Is it a key lime? Is it the lime peel? I'd say we're definitely in the more tart category, almost like lemon or lime peels specifically. And do any of those other flavor categories stand out to us in the aromas? I would say a little bit of orchard fruit, specifically apple. For extra points, what's the color or ripeness of that? I want to say green apple in particular, and also probably particularly the skins. Moving on to the taste. Cheers. So first, of course, you're going to notice that delightfully refreshing acidity, and that's pretty characteristic of Sauvignon Blanc. It'll be a little softer on your second sip. So are we tasting those flavors that we were smelling? Definitely the lemon and lime. I'd say a little bit more in the lime territory, like a key lime. Green apple's definitely coming through. So you might be wondering, how do they get those lime and apple flavors in there with the wine? It's not a stupid question. I've been asked it many times before. And when it comes to the flavors in wine, there's basically three categories of where the flavors come from. Either the grape itself, because regular wine, like wine made from grapes, is just made from grapes. There's nothing else in there. There's no limes, there's no apples in there. We have 100% Sauvignon Blanc here. So there are characteristic flavors that are inherent just to the different grape varietals themselves. Then there's also some aspects of flavor that are contributed by the specific place in which those grapes were grown. And lastly, there are certain winemaking choices that occur in the winery that can also have an impact on flavor. So, as I mentioned, with Sauvignon Blanc, you're usually going to have those characteristic lime, limestone, and grassy flavors. And those are all just unique to the Sauvignon Blanc grape itself. It's just coming from the grape naturally. In terms of where the grape is grown affects those flavors, these grapes for our Sauvignon Blanc came from Lodi, California, which is an area about 70 miles east or inland from Napa Valley. Now, it's really warm and sunny in Lodi, California. By contrast, think of grapes grown in like cold, cloudy France. So the main difference there is going to be that in a place like Lodi, California, where it's nice and sunny, the grapes have a chance to get really ripe and the fruit flavors get to come out a lot more based on the climate in which they're grown. Whereas in France, where it's cold and cloudy, they don't have a chance to get quite as ripe. The fruit flavors don't have a chance to get quite as developed, and instead you'll have a lot more of a mineral aspect shining through and a little bit more muted fruit flavors. Finally, there are the winemaking choices that occur in the winery. So a winemaker can choose to age a wine in oak or just let it hang out in stainless steel. Our 2019 Sauvignon Blanc only saw stainless steel, no oak, and even though stainless steel doesn't have any effect, doesn't add any flavors, doesn't take away any flavors from the wine, it is important to know that certain flavors are coming specifically from oak. They're not inherent in the type of grape itself. And we'll be able to talk more about the taste effects of oak when we get into the red wine. One last thing that I didn't mention yet, because I didn't want to keep us all thirsty, is how white wine is made. I already kind of skipped ahead to aging, but going back to the actual fermentation process, to make a white wine, you take grapes, like Sauvignon Blanc grapes, you squish them, you let the juice run out, and you ferment just the juice, leaving the skins behind. And again, that difference will come into play as we get into our rosé and our red wine. But before we move on, I do of course want to say something about pairings, because I know everyone loves some food and wine pairing recommendations. Dry white wines like Sauvignon Blanc are extremely versatile with food. They pair with quite a good deal of things. They're an exceptionally good choice for any appetizer cheese course white wine is a great place to start overall because that nice, refreshing, mouth-watering acidity kind of gets your palate ready to enjoy a nice big meal, and particularly with rich, creamy cheeses like brie or mozzarella. The acidity, which might seem a little bit much on its own, is actually going to do the work of cutting through the richness of those cheeses and kind of balancing out the food and wine that you're enjoying together. In terms of things besides cheese, Sauvignon Blanc or any dry white wines are excellent pairings with oysters on the half shell, seafood. This in particular would be really great with like ceviche while it's still warm out. Moving on to the 2019 Sparkling Rosé, which I so confidently said that I was going to demonstrate the proper opening technique for you with. Now, I know sparkling wine can maybe seem like a bit daunting of a task to open it, but the method that I'm going to show you not only is the proper method used by fancy sommeliers and restaurants and whatnot, it's the proper method because it's the method that affords you the most control, therefore making it the safest method. So, what we're going to want to do first is go ahead and grab like the largest sword you happen to have lying around your house, like a machete or a saber. I'm totally kidding. I couldn't resist that one. How we're actually going to begin, we're going to go ahead and remove the foil first. I know I cheated a little bit, but the rest is hard. Well, no, it's easy, and I'm going to show you how. So I want to draw your attention to the wire that is around the cork. That's called the cage. And the cage is there in order so that the cork doesn't go flying out because of course the contents are under pressure. So the cage keeps you from denting your ceiling or your face. Now the main thing that we want to remember in terms of proper opening is that that cage is going to stay on. And we're going to put our dominant hand thumb. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to go ahead and grip this with my right hand and place my right thumb on top, pointing it away from my face and away from the camera. And then you can see there the little untwisty bit, not the technical term, of the wire cage. And I'm going to keep my thumb on top of the cork before I untwist it, and my thumb is not going to leave the top, okay? So now that you've had your first glass of wine, come along, follow along, don't be scared. Keep your thumb on top. We're going to untwist that about 6 times, actually is usually exactly perfect. Now, the cage is untwisted, but my thumb is keeping it secure. The next important thing about this proper method of opening sparkling, besides always keeping your thumb on top, is that we are going to keep our thumb and our top hand in place and actually twist the bottle with our bottom hand. Slight readjustment of my finger positioning there. And when we're twisting it, we don't want to twist it back and forth. I'm going to twist it smoothly in one direction. You'll feel how evenly and easily that pressure starts to release. Just keep twisting it slowly. And as you feel the pressure build, twist it even more slowly. Ideally, the cork doesn't go flying out like we like to see in movies where it's all festive. Who wants to waste that wine? Ideally, it's going to be so graceful that it almost doesn't make a noise. Whew. Close enough. Let me go ahead and pour myself a glass of this. That would have been really funny if I overflowed it after demonstrating the proper pouring, huh? Or the proper opening. Look at that beautiful color. In terms of proper serving temperature, since we've been talking about that and I showed you the proper opening method, sparkling wine, like white wine, you don't want it right out of the fridge, although sparkling wine should technically be served coldest of all the styles of wine at about 45 to 50 degrees. However, here we do have a rosé, which like that same reasoning I gave for the white wine, we want to be able to appreciate those aromas by having it be ever so slightly warmer. 45 to 50 degrees is going to be ideal for the sparkling wine here. So just take it out of your fridge and let it hang out for about 15-20 minutes before you go ahead and enjoy some. Now, rosé is made in its own unique way, just like white wine, just like red wine, and rosé is actually kind of in between how white and red wine are made. I already explained with white wine that you take the grapes, you squish them, you take just the juice and ferment that, leaving the skins behind. I'm gonna jump ahead to red wine because, as I said, rosé is kind of in the middle. With red wine, you take the grapes, you squish them, you get the juice, but then you ferment everything all together. The juice and the skins stay together in the fermentation process the whole time. And the skins are where all of those tannic structures, all the richness, and all the color is coming from in red wine. So, since rosé is kind of in the middle, can we maybe kind of guess a little bit at home as to what the process might be? So with rosé, you take red grapes, you squish them. In this case, we have 65% Pinot Noir and 35% Chardonnay. So you take the grapes, you squish them, you get the juice, and you let the skins hang out for just a little bit in the fermentation process. So the skins are in there for just a little bit. They add just a kiss of color, and then they're taken out for the rest of the fermentation process. So that's where we get the pink color from. I'll save my explanation where the bubbles come from until after we investigate the aromas and then taste it. I'll save my explanation until after we get to try it. All right, so with white wine, we had citrus fruit, orchard fruit, and tropical fruit to jog our imaginations. With rosé, I want to add one more category to that imagination jogging list, and that's red fruit. Not really that complicated. So, give a little swirl. So I think what's standing out mostly are the red fruits. So think of all the red fruits you can think of. Strawberry, cranberry, raspberry. I think we're definitely in the strawberry and raspberry camp here. Extra points for asking about the ripeness or quality of those particular fruits. Are they tart and unripe? Are they ripe and fruity? Or are they baked and almost like matured or even dried? I'd say we have ripe, juicy, fruity, raspberry, and strawberries. Any other categories coming out? I guess it's technically in between orchard fruit and red fruit, but red apple, I'm getting like a red, delicious apple, like the skin of it, you know, all like freshly polished, pulled out of your lunch bag or whatever. Red apple. And are there any floral components? I definitely want to say some like rose petals. Okay, enough already. Cheers, let's try this one. Oh wow. All right, so this wine, you'll notice, is actually a dry sparkling wine, meaning it's not sweet, although it is very, very fruity. You see brut on the label there. You might have thought that that means sparkling wine, but actually it means specifically a dry, as in not sweet sparkling wine. If you ever see demi-sec on a label of sparkling wine, that means slightly sweet. And if you see sec, S-E-C, that means that it'll be quite sweet. In terms of the flavors that we're tasting, I'd say they're pretty similar to the aromas that we were encountering. We have that strawberry and raspberry definitely coming through as nice and ripe and juicy, not tart, not overripe. The rose, see if you can focus in on that. Extra points for color, so yeah, red rose, but you know, there are other colors of roses. And I'm getting like a slight bit of greenery, almost like there's just a couple of rose leaves in there with the petals, but as we already know, it's only made from grapes. All these amazing flavors are just coming from the unique inherent characteristics of the grapes themselves. I did already explain where the pink color of rosé comes from, but where do the bubbles come from? There's two main ways of making sparkling wine. I mentioned here that we do have Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and those are traditional grapes used to make champagne. However, besides having those specific grapes, champagne comes from a particular region of France, and it's made, as I said, in a particular way in which the bubbles occur via a secondary fermentation that occurs in the individual bottle itself, and it's also aged a really long time. So that's where you get those kind of minerally matured flavors of champagne from, whereas here we have like bright, fresh, juicy, fruity flavors. That's because of the difference in which this sparkling wine is made. It's not made in the way that champagne is made. It is made in what is called the tank or Charmat method. Charmat was the name of the French dude who patented this process in the early 1900s, but it was actually invented by an Italian guy about a decade earlier. What that method involves is making the wine first. We know that rosé is made by fermenting the grapes, the juice, and the skins together for just a little bit of time, then taking the skins out and letting it finish. As soon as that fermentation is complete, all that wine is in a great big vat, and they actually carbonate the whole vat, then bottle the individual bottles of sparkling wine right away. So to put it simply, champagne, the bubbles are made in the individual bottles and aged a really long time. Whereas the tank or Charmat method, which is the method that we have represented here, the bubbles are added to a great big vat right after the wine's done fermenting, and then it's bottled. So the important difference between those two methods in terms of the flavor effects that we're able to taste in the wine is that the tank or Charmat method is giving us those nice, bright, fresh, fruity flavors because there's not that aging process like there is with champagne. Fun fact, the tank or Charmat method is also the method used to make Prosecco, and is also the reason why Prosecco has those nice, bright, fresh, fruity flavors just like we have here in our rosé. Now I explained the bubbles, I explained the pink, but you might be wondering, where do the different shades of pink come from in rosé? I've already explained this business about leaving the skins in there for some amount of time, and then taking them out, and that's where the bit of color comes from. So you can leave the skins in there for a little bit of time, kind of a medium time, or like a lot of bit of time. That should have pretty obvious effects on what the color is going to be. So looking at the pretty rich color of this rosé, would you guess that the skins were in there for just a little bit or kind of a lot of it? The answer is kind of a lot, because that's what's giving us this richer color coming from the skins of the rosé. So that's where the pink comes from, that's where the bubbles come from, and that's where all these nice, fresh, fruity flavors come from. Doesn't that make the wine taste so much more delicious to know all these fun things? I know one thing that does make wine more delicious, back of course to food and wine pairings. Now, I'm not usually the biggest fan of white wine, white meat, red wine, red meat in terms of the food and wine pairing rule. However, with rosé, that's a good way to go. So matching the color of our wine to any meat we might be eating, salmon is a classic rosé pairing, and pork as well, but specifically like pork chops, because moving beyond that simple white wine, white meat, red wine, red meat, think of like a plain-ish pork chop versus pork that's been barbecued and covered in barbecue sauce. Instead of matching colors, we want to think about matching intensity. So that barbecued pork is just going to be too big and bold to go with this delicate fruity rosé, whereas with a pork chop that maybe just has a little bit of butter and herb seasoning, this would be actually perfect. So again, think more about matching intensity as opposed to just purely matching colors as you evolve in your own food and wine pairing skills. All right, so we are going to finish today with our 2016 Teroldego-Petite Sirah blend. And of course, I have more fun winemaking techniques to explain to you about where all the wonderful flavors, aromas, and colors are coming from in this particular blend, but I'll also be giving you a slightly different imagination jogging framework for improving your own tasting skills when it comes to red wine in particular. So white wine, citrus fruit, orchard fruit, tropical fruit. Red wine, we're thinking mostly just in terms of colors. Think about red fruit, blue or purple fruit, and black fruit as the starting point for picking up on later subtleties. So, before we smell and taste, I probably should point out the proper serving temperature for red wine because this one's kind of a big deal. The proper serving temperature for red wine is not room temperature. I know, but don't feel bad. Most restaurants make this mistake, even like fancy restaurants tend to serve their red wine at room temperature. But just like everything I've explained so far, it's not just like a rule for the sake of rules. There's a really good reason for why you don't want to serve your red wine at room temperature. In fact, the proper serving temperature for red wine, particularly full-bodied reds like we have here, is as chilled as 65 degrees. And for lighter body red wines like Pinot Noir, Grenache, Gamay, those should be served as chilled as 55 degrees. Back to our big bold red here though, that very good reason that I promised you as to why you don't want to serve it any warmer than 65 degrees is because at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, alcohol actually starts to evaporate. Now, that's not to say that like the reason's not because you want all the alcohol, but the reason is, again, to appreciate all the proper nuances of the wine. So if this were served warmer than 68 degrees, the alcohol would literally be evaporating into the glass, and instead of being able to smell the fruits, the minerals, all those other aspects, basically all you'd be able to smell is like burning alcohol. Likewise, when you drink it, if you're drinking a red wine at too warm of a temperature, you're going to get a lot more of that like burning alcohol sensation than you're actually supposed to. So to ensure that you are serving your red wine at proper 65 degrees, you can either pop the room temperature bottle into your fridge for about 20 minutes, you can pop it in your freezer for about 5 to 10 minutes, or if you don't want to wait for any of that proper business, my personal favorite trick is to just regularly keep a wine glass in my freezer. That way, you can just take whatever room temperature bottle of red wine you have, pour yourself a little glass, and it's magically, instantly, just a little bit chilled. Do me a favor though, please don't put ice in your wine, not in your white wine, not in your red wine. It will literally dilute the flavors, and quite simply, it's just not fancy. Just please don't do it. So anyway, let's smell this so that we can taste it. As I said for red wine, we want to ask our imagination about broad fruit color categories: red, blue, purple, black. There are other aromas and flavors we'll be encountering, but it's usually easiest to start with fruit. So what color are we smelling? I want to say mostly purple, specifically like plums and maybe some dark cherries, and extra points, as always, for asking about the quality or ripeness level of those fruits. I would say that we're a little beyond ripe and juicy. We're almost into like the baked or the dried category, like dried plums, which technically are prunes, but I'm just gonna say dried plums. And there's also like a raisiny aspect to it as well. I'll wait to explain the reasons for those particular fruit quality characteristics that we're smelling. But just very quickly, before we get to taste it, are there any other aspects that you're able to pick out on the nose besides just those fruit flavors? Like any herbal or maybe kind of woody aspects to it? Yeah, you could say cedar or oak or even cigar, and there's a reason for that as well that I'll wait to explain. Enough already. Let's have a sip. Cheers once more. Oh yeah. Quite rich, very complex, very delicious. Still tasting that plum and raisin aspect, like specifically dried fruits. There is a little bit of blueberry on the palate that I didn't quite get on the nose. Those are just fancy terms, feel free to use them. But then there's all these other more complicated flavors, like that smoky, woody element that we were smelling. And also, see if you can hone in on this one. There's like a dark chocolate or espresso quality to it. More subtly, I would also say there's even an herbal element, kind of like sage. And the other interesting kind of dried out flavor, which is kind of going to sound crazy, but leather, like old leather-bound books. Delicious, in my opinion. So now that we've gotten to have a sip, I get to explain all those fun winemaking techniques that I mentioned would be here in our red wine. We do already know how red wine is made in its simplest form. You take the grapes, you squish them, you ferment the skins and the juice together. But then, with red wine, you can choose whether or not to age it. Before I get that far though, I should have mentioned that in this particular blend of Teroldego-Petite Sirah, Teroldego is a originally Italian grape. Herein we have 65% and Petite Sirah is of French origin and we have 35%. So a lot of the flavors are coming from those grapes themselves. The particular grapes in our Teroldego-Petite Sirah were grown in California, but I just wanted to explain where they originate. So, how wines that are blended are usually made is by fermenting the two types of grapes separately. So, you might take a Merlot and a Cabernet, make those wines separate, and then the winemaker gets to have a lot of control in this method because they get to experiment with like different ratios of both to create the perfect blend after the fermentation. However, this red wine blend is made in a different method, and the best way of explaining why this other method is so cool, it's very rare also, by the way, but the best example for explaining why it's so good is stew. So, stew has these delicious, harmonious textures and flavors because all of the ingredients are cooked together. If you were to cook meat and vegetables and sauce separately and then mix it together at the end, you wouldn't have quite the same harmonious flavors and textures that you do when you cook it all together. So, you're probably following along here. The method that was used to make this particular blend was to take the two kinds of grapes and actually ferment them together. Now the winemaker does have a little bit less control in this method. However, the benefit again are those harmonious flavors and textures. The name of this method is called co-fermentation, like fermenting together. And the name for the other more common method of creating a blended wine is called cuvée, which sounds very fancy, but it just means blended in French. So back to red wine making overall. after it's fermented, a winemaker gets to choose whether to age the wine and also what to age it in. Almost all red wines are aged in oak barrels. It has many desirable effects, including mostly softening the texture of the wine and taking out any possible harshness. Now, bear with me because there are even further choices that come with the choice to age a wine in oak barrels, like whether to use American oak or French oak, or whether to use new oak or used oak. I'll keep it short though. So American oak simply is a lot more flavorful than French oak, and it's not as expensive. And all oak barrels for wine are toasted on the inside, just like barrels for making bourbon are toasted. New oak refers to oak barrels that have been freshly toasted and have not been used to make wine before, whereas old or used oak refers to wine barrels that have been used to make wine before. So the effects of aging wine in oak, besides softening the textures, and this applies to new or old oak, it has a very particular effect on not the fruit flavors, but of the quality of those fruit flavors. What happens is when a red wine is fresh and young, the fruit flavors are either kind of tart or they're a little bit riper. But when you age it in oak, those flavors become a little bit more matured. And if you age something in oak for a really long time, those fruit flavors will move all the way to almost tasting like the dried versions of the original fruit. So, thinking back about new oak, about old oak, about how long to age it, let's have a sip and remember all of those wonderful flavor aspects that we picked out in this blend. So first I want to focus on those kind of woody, oaky characteristics. I mentioned new oak, freshly toasted. Old oak, the toastiness has kind of already been seeped into the first wine that was used. So, fun little guessing game. Based on the pretty bold, woody, oaky flavors that we're tasting here, would you guess that this is aged in new or old oak? That's right, it's aged in new oak, specifically new American oak. Now, for the question of exactly how long it was aged in oak, think back to what I said about how if you age something in oak for a really long time, you get almost all the way to dried flavors like prune and raisin. So, I mean, I kind of already gave it away, but would you say that this is aged in oak for just a little bit of time or like a lot of time? That is right. This is aged in American oak for a total of 28 months, which relatively is a really long time. Most American red wine is aged in oak for 6 months, maybe a year, not really much longer. So a lot of extra time, attention, and love went into developing the flavors of this particular wine. I know I covered a lot of ground with all of that, but what I do want you to focus on is to remember that there are some qualities that are coming from the grapes themselves, a little bit from where those particular grapes are grown, and then there are other flavors that are coming specifically from how the wine is processed, such as being aged in oak, and what kind, and for how long, etc. Back to something I know everyone loves, food and wine pairings. Bold red wines are definitely suited to red meat. Thinking beef short ribs, brisket, steak, and back to the idea of matching standout flavors of the wine with standout flavors of the food. I think that smoky, oaky, leathery quality would be best paired specifically with barbecued red meat. So, barbecued ribs, briskets barbecued, anything barbecued, because again, you're going to be creating that interesting bridge between the oaky, woody flavors of the wine along with the food. So in closing, I want to explain that the actually cool thing about learning all this technical stuff about how wine is made isn't just knowledge for its own sake, and it's not just to be able to drop some fancy knowledge on your friends, but feel free. The actually cool thing about understanding all of this is that as you learn more and as you learn the specific flavors that you enjoy or the particular qualities, and then you learn what particular aspects of the wine are giving you those qualities, such as maybe the oak in the Teroldego-Petite Sirah. When you learn more about what causes the flavors and characteristics that you like, then you can go out and find more wine that's made in a similar way and find more delicious wine that is suited to your particular taste. So maybe, for example, you really like that oaky element in the Teroldego-Petite Sirah, so you can go to a wine shop and hopefully there's an informed person working there who you can ask for a really long oak-aged wine. Or maybe you're a little bit more in enjoying the tart acidity of this Sauvignon Blanc. And now that you know that it's aged in stainless steel and not in oak, you can go to a wine shop and ask someone for other unoaked white wines to try. Another fun fact, since I've explained these different ways that flavors get contributed to wines, Chardonnay doesn't taste like butter inherently. That's coming from the fact that it's aged in oak, usually. So, if you enjoy the nice, bright, tart acidity of Sauvignon Blanc, maybe experiment with an unoaked Chardonnay, or other varieties of unoaked white wines like Pinot Grigio, for example, or Vermentino. They make a really good Vermentino here at Lynfred. Now, I hope that you did enjoy this guided tasting. And remember, there's no like right or wrong answer in terms of what type of wine you enjoy. It's all about learning more about why you like what you like so that you're able to go find more delicious wines to enjoy. I really hope you did enjoy this virtual guided tasting experience today, and I hope you learned a little bit too. And remember, a portion of the proceeds from this tasting package that you purchased are going to benefit a local charity committed to solving hunger in the local community of Roselle. So if you know anyone else who you think might enjoy this virtual guided tasting experience, order them a kit. You can do it online. Lynfred will even deliver it to their door. So until I see you and your friends next time, cheers.